Chapter 1. Echoes in Ash. The rain wasn't rain. Not really. It was ash, fine as powdered bone, perpetually weeping from a sky that had long since abandoned its blue. It coated everything. The crumbling stone of the Silent Fief, the skeletal remains of what had once been a village, even the rusted steel of the Ronin's own armor. A patchwork of scavenged plates and dark, oiled leather. It tasted of regret and decay, a constant gritty reminder of the world's slow, agonizing demise. Had been walking for what felt like an eternity, though the gnawing certainty of time was a luxury he could scarcely afford. The years, or perhaps they were centuries, had blurred into a monotonous cycle of rain, ash, and the relentless pursuit of a shadow. His name, if he ever possessed one, was lost to the ages, a forgotten syllable swallowed by the silence of the fief. He's simply a solitary figure carved from grief and honed to a lethal point, a weapon against a tide of horrors he understood intimately, yet could never truly comprehend. He moved with a disconcerting grace, a predator conserving energy in a world of endless, draining struggle. The wind, a mournful sigh through shattered archways, seemed to guide him, urging him deeper into the heart of the Silent Fief. He wasn't driven by a grand purpose, not anymore. The echoes of his past, a lost clan, a shattered oath, a love consumed by the void, had long since faded into the background noise of his existence, leaving only the imperative to bodily, to kill. The air here was thick, not with humidity, but with a palpable wrongness. The scent of rot wasn't merely the decomposition of flesh and wood, it was the corruption of something, a primal, malignant essence that clung to the back of the throat and stole the breath. The silence itself was oppressive, punctuated only by the crackle of the ash and the unsettling hum that vibrated through the very ground, a chorus of trapped souls, desperate to be released. Had come to the fief on a whisper, a fragmented legend carried on the wind by desperate refugees fleeing the sorcerer-priests who held sway over the remaining settlements. They spoke of the Void Weaver, a being not born of magic, but of oblivion itself, a devourer of souls who reshaped the land to mirror his grotesque desires. They said he commanded legions of twisted constructs, animated by the stolen echoes of the dead, and that only a weapon touched by the divine could stand against him. Had scoffed at the legends initially. Years of combat had taught him to distrust the pronouncements of the fearful, yet the evidence was undeniable. The shattered remains of the village, meticulously arranged into geometric nightmares, the bone-white faces of the constructs that patrolled the ruins, the palpable aura of malignant power. It was all too real. The legends, he was beginning to realize, were not just stories, they were warnings. The first encounter had been a brutal baptism. The Scourge, as the Weaver's constructs were known, emerged from the earth as if summoned by a malevolent thought. They were nightmares given form limbs of sharpened wood, faces of cracked obsidian, eyes that glowed with an internal sickly light. Had dispatched them with a grim efficiency, each strike deliberate, fueled by a cold, unwavering resolve. He didn't revel in the carnage, didn't even seem to register the agonizing screams of the constructs before they dissolved into ash. It was simply a process, a necessary cleansing. Had climbed the crumbling tower, a testament to the Weaver's arrogance, not with a strategy, but with instinct. The tower was a labyrinth of warped iron and pulsing shadow, adorned with unsettling carvings depicting scenes of souls being consumed. As he ascended, he became acutely aware of the Weaver's presence. It wasn't a direct confrontation, not yet. It was a feeling, a cold weight on his mind, a subtle urging, a sense of being watched by something impossibly ancient and utterly malevolent. The Weaver, he discovered, was not a towering behemoth, but a contained echo. He resided within the tower's core, a being of pure, corrupted energy, projecting his influence outwards through the constructs. His voice, when it finally reached the Ronin, wasn't spoken. but rather a torrent of agonizing whispers. Each one a fragment of a stolen life, a testament to the Weaver's hunger. "You cannot stop it," the Weaver hissed, the words resonating not in his ears, but directly within his mind. "This is the inevitable decay. All things return to the void." The Ronin didn't respond. He merely tightened his grip on Winter's breath, the blade pulsing with a faint ethereal light. He drew a deeper breath, centering himself, channeling the last vestiges of his training. Not the crude, brute force techniques he'd learned in his youth, but something older, something closer to the forgotten gods. This wasn't mere swordsmanship. It was a ritual of retribution, a desperate plea for balance in a world consumed by imbalance. He was a conduit, a vessel, and the blade was merely the instrument. Chapter 2: Echoes of the Fallen. The air in the tower's core thickened, not with the cloying sweetness of decay, but with a deeper, colder pressure. The carvings pulsed with a sickly luminescence, and the whispers intensified, coalescing into fragments of screams. A child's lost laughter abruptly silenced. A warrior's last desperate roar, the mournful sigh of a queen betrayed. The Ronin, whose name even to himself felt increasingly irrelevant, remained a statue of unwavering focus. Winter's breath a silver shard against the oppressive gloom. The relentless assault on his senses wasn't overwhelming, not precisely. It was a carefully cultivated erosion, a deliberate unraveling of his defenses. The Weaver wasn't attempting to physically strike him. He was attempting to dissect the last flicker of integrity within the Ronin's soul. It was a cruel, psychological torture, a symphony of broken hopes and shattered realities. The constant barrage of stolen voices forced a subtle shift in the Ronin's posture. He moved with a practiced grace, but there was a tension beneath the surface, a barely contained strain visible in the tightening of his muscles. He reached a chamber dominated by a central pillar of solidified darkness. The pillar wasn't merely a structure at the Weaver. It was a swirling vortex of corrupted energy, vaguely humanoid in shape, but constantly shifting, expanding, contracting, as if struggling against an unseen restraint. Around the pillar, intricate glyphs, ancient and utterly unrecognizable, spiraled outwards, absorbing the residual energy of the surrounding constructs and feeding the Weaver's power. The Weaver's voice, though still primarily internal, sharpened, becoming less a torrent of despair and more a precise, calculating question. "You cling to notions of balance," it hissed, the words layering upon each other like a corrosive acid. "Balance is a myth. Entropy is the only constant. The universe seeks only to return to its foundational state, chaos. Your attempts at preservation are futile, a defiant whisper against the howling void." The Ronin remained silent, his gaze fixed on the pulsating pillar. He raised Winter's breath, not as a weapon, but as an offering. The blade flared with a brilliant, almost painful light, bathing the chamber in a temporary ethereal glow. It wasn't an attack, but an amplification. He was drawing upon the very essence of the rising sun, attempting to flood the chamber with a force that the Weaver's containment could not withstand. "Why?" the Weaver demanded, the single word imbued with a terrifying frustration. "Why do you resist? What drives you to cling to these sea artifacts of hope?" The Ronin finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly murmur, utterly devoid of inflection. "Because absence breeds corruption. Silence invites the void. To accept your premise is to surrender." He didn't elaborate, didn't justify his actions. The simple assertion, delivered with unwavering conviction, seemed to momentarily disrupt the Weaver's flow. The pillar shuddered, the glyphs dimmed slightly, and the intensity of the whispers lessened, though not entirely silenced. Then, with a chilling shift, the Weaver initiated a new tactic. It didn't attack physically. Instead, it focused its influence directly on the Ronin's memories. Not his own memories, but fragments of memories gleaned from the countless souls trapped within the Weaver's dominion. He was flooded with images: a farmer tending his fields, a woman weeping for her lost child, a knight receiving a solemn oath, a lover's embrace, each image overlaid with the Weaver's perverse interpretation, twisted into representations of pain and despair. He fought back, not with force, but with discipline. He compartmentalized, erecting mental barriers, actively refusing to engage with the torrent of stolen emotions. It was agonizing, a draining exercise in willpower, yet he persevered, focusing on the core principle of his training, the channeling of divine energy, not as a weapon, but as a purification. The ancient technique, the gatekeeper's severance, was now crucial. It wasn't a technique of brute force, it was an act of surgical precision, a stripping away of the Weaver's influence at its point of entry, his very consciousness. He visualized the flow of energy, a stream of corrupted light attempting to breach the wall of his mind, and with a deliberate, agonizing movement, he redirected the flow, severing the connection. The chamber fell silent. The pillar stilled. The whispers ceased. The Weaver's influence, momentarily broken, retreated back into its core, leaving behind a residue of palpable unease. As the last vestiges of the attack faded, the Ronin slowly lowered Winter's breath, the blade now radiating a subdued, almost mournful light. He turned to face the pillar, and for the first time saw not just a source of corruption, but a wound, a desperate, agonizing attempt to escape a fate far more terrifying than oblivion. "You are not a god," the Weaver whispered, the words barely audible, yet resonating with an unnerving certainty. "You are merely a reflection of the suffering you seek to alleviate, and all reflections eventually shatter." The Ronin considered this, his face impassive. He knew the Weaver spoke a truth, a chillingly accurate assessment of his own purpose. Yet, he also knew that he wouldn't yield. He wouldn't succumb to despair. He would continue to fight, not for balance, but for the chance, however slim, to prevent the final, inevitable shattering. He raised Winter's breath once more, not in aggression, but in quiet, unwavering defiance. "Then let us see how well your reflection holds." Chapter 3. Echoes of the Severance. The dawn arrived not with warmth, but with a bruised, sickly violet, clinging to the ravaged landscape of the Silent Fief. The crimson haze, once a suffocating blanket, had thinned marginally, revealing a world sculpted by decay, a panorama of splintered stone, choked with ash, and the skeletal remains of what had once been life. The air still tasted of something ancient and profoundly wrong, a metallic tang overlaid with the sickly sweetness of rotting magic. The Ronin, whose name remained unspoken, stood before the pillar, Winter's breath radiating a dull, sorrowful luminescence. He hadn't slept. Not truly. The encounter with the Weaver, the brief but terrifying unraveling of his own consciousness, had left a residue of disorientation, a lingering vibration of corrupted thought. Had spent the long, unsettling hours since systematically examining the pillar, seeking not answers, but the source of the wound that had nearly consumed him. He wasn't a scholar, not in the traditional sense. His understanding of magic wasn't gleaned from dusty tomes or whispered legends. It was born of experience, a brutal, visceral comprehension forged in the crucible of conflict and despair. The Weaver's words, whispered with a chillingly precise logic, echoed in his mind. "You are merely a reflection of the suffering you seek to alleviate. And all reflections eventually shatter." The statement, devoid of judgment, was a profound observation, a cold mirror reflecting the desperate nature of his own actions. He shifted his stance, the movement fluid and practiced, a dance honed over countless battles against horrors he couldn't fully comprehend. He wasn't driven by righteous fury, nor even by a desire for grand, cosmic balance. His motivation was something far more personal, a stubborn refusal to accept the inevitable oblivion had glimpsed the cessation of everything. He noticed a subtle change. The pillar, previously a monolithic block of warped iron, now pulsed with a faint, irregular rhythm. The residue of the weaver's influence hadn't entirely dissipated. Instead, it had become organized, almost like a burgeoning network of thought. He reached out with winter's breath, not to strike, but to dodge. The blade, responding to his intent, hummed with a resonant frequency, and a stream of fragmented images flooded his mind. He saw not a single point of corruption, but a multitude countless shards of pain, loss, and regret, coalescing around the pillar, feeding its dark energy. These weren't simply echoes of the weaver's malice, they were the accumulated suffering of generations trapped within the fief. The silent screams of the twisted villages, the anguish of the dead souls tethered to the land. He understood then. The weaver hadn't merely created the constructs he had to spare. The pillar wasn't a conduit for his magic, it was a repository. A gigantic, agonizing sponge soaking up the psychic residue of suffering. And he, in his attempt to sever the connection, hadn't simply broken a spell had disrupted a delicate, horrifying equilibrium. The severance wasn't a complete severing, he murmured, his voice a low rasp. It created a fracture, a conduit, a way for the echoes to flow. He didn't attempt to repair the fracture. Instead, he began a different ritual, one less defined by ancient discipline and more by instinct. He channeled the energy had initially diverted from the weaver, focusing it not on negation, but on orwa. He visualized winter's breath as a river, carving a new channel through the chaos, not to block the flow, but to guide it. The blade flared with an intense white light, bathing the pillar in its brilliance. The pulsating rhythm intensified, and a wave of fragmented memories, sharper and more defined than before, assaulted his mind. He saw the rise and fall of the villages, the brutal skirmishes that led to their corruption, the moments of unbearable grief and loss that fueled the weaver's power. It wasn't a comfortable experience. It was a torrent of anguish, a direct confrontation with the darkest corners of existence. But he didn't falter. He embraced the pain, absorbing it, understanding it. He realized that the weaver hadn't created the suffering, he had simply given it form, shape, and power. The true enemy wasn't a sorcerer, it was the very potential for despair that resided within the human heart. As the final vestiges of the memory storm receded, winter's breath returned to its muted luminescence. The pillar remained unchanged, but something had shifted. The irregular pulse was gone, replaced by a steady, almost meditative thrum. The air still held the scent of decay, but it was tempered now, overlaid with a subtle note of peace. The Ronin lowered the blade, his expression unreadable. He knew the weaver wasn't vanquished, not truly. Its influence lingered, a shadow clinging to the edges of reality. But he had learned a crucial truth: the fight wasn't about destroying evil, but about containing it, about acknowledging its existence without succumbing to its seductive embrace. He turned, not towards the horizon, but towards the path, leading deeper into the Silent Fief. "Let us see what echoes remain," he whispered, the words carrying a quiet, resolute defiance. "And perhaps, in facing them, we can finally begin to understand what it truly means to be a reflection." Chapter 4. The Cartographer of Echoes. The rain started subtly, a fine, insistent drizzle that mirrored the persistent ache behind the Ronin's eyes. It wasn't the rain of the surface world, clean and sharp, but a viscous gray mist drawn up from the bone-soaked earth of the Silent Fief. It clung to winter's breath, dulling its luminescence, and seemed to seep into the very fabric of his being, amplifying the phantom memories he was now forced to confront. He followed the winding path deeper into the fief, not with the purposeful stride of a warrior, but with the careful deliberation of a scholar studying a crumbling manuscript. The carvings of the twisted villages, once instruments of the weaver's torment, had softened with time. The obsidian faces slick with the perpetual rain. Some were almost obscured, swallowed by the relentless creep of the fungal growth that now draped every surface, a sickly lavender, pulsing with a faint, unnerving warmth. Had abandoned the pursuit of immediate action, of vanquishing the lingering echoes of the weaver's influence. The battle at the tower had been a brutal necessity, a desperate act of survival. Now, he realized, survival wasn't about actively fighting, but about understanding the source of the fight, the insidious currents that sought to drag him back into the abyss. His movements were guided by a newfound awareness, a subtle shift in his perception. He carried with him no map, no compass, only a growing understanding of the fief's echoes, not in the literal sense of reverberating energy, but in the fractured remnants of emotions, of intentions, of the lives devoured by the weaver. He was, in essence, a cartographer of despair, painstakingly charting the contours of the valley's psychic landscape. He stopped before what remained of a blacksmith's forge, now a blackened maw in the hillside. The scent here was overwhelming, not just the metallic tang of iron and decay, but a profound sadness, thick with regret and the desperate hope of a craftsman long dead. He knelt, running a gloved hand over the warped remnants of a workbench. He didn't attempt to fight the memory, didn't channel winter's breath. Instead, he simply He sensed the artisan, a man named Silas, pouring his entire being into the creation of a single, intricate sword, a sword intended as a gift for his daughter, lost to a bandit raid. Silas' frustration, his burning determination, his agonizing grief, coalesced around him, almost tangible. The Ronin felt the weight of his unfulfilled promise, the crushing weight of a father's despair. It wasn't a violent surge, not a physical blow, but a quiet, penetrating understanding. He sought to build a shield, the Ronin murmured, his voice a low rumble lost in the rain. Not against men, but against the inevitable decay of hope. He moved on, following a trail of these fractured remnants: a child's discarded toy, a farmer's abandoned plow, a priest's shattered prayer book. Each encounter offered a shard of insight, a piece of the weaver's tapestry of torment. He realized the sorcerer hadn't merely souls had cultivated them, nurtured them into monstrous extensions of his own despair. The weaver hadn't created the suffering head, perfected it. He eventually arrived at a vast ruined cathedral, its soaring arches choked with vines and the skeletal remains of stained glass. It was here, he sensed, that the core of the weaver's influence was strongest. The air pulsed with a suffocating sense of hopelessness, a vortex of broken vows and extinguished dreams. As he stepped into the nave, he didn't raise winter's breath. Instead, he simply stood, facing the ruined altar, and allowed the weight of the echoes to flow over him. He embraced the overwhelming grief, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. He saw the robed figures of the priests, consumed by fear and self-doubt, desperately trying to stave off the inevitable. He felt the agonizing pleas of the villagers, begging for salvation, their faith crumbling under the relentless pressure of despair. He saw the weaver, not as a malevolent entity, but as a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest anxieties. And then he understood. The weaver wasn't locked in a battle against evil. He was locked in a battle against himself, against the inherent human capacity for fear, for regret, for the seductive promise of oblivion. The rain intensified, transforming into a torrential downpour. But the Ronin didn't flinch. He drew winter's breath, not to strike, but to illuminate. The blade's light cut through the oppressive darkness, revealing not a monster, but a profound, heartbreaking truth. "There is no slaying of demons," he whispered, his voice now resonant with a quiet, solemn power. "There is only acceptance." The last vestiges of the weaver's influence, finally, shattered, not with a dramatic explosion, but with a gentle, mournful sigh. The rain began to subside, and a single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the ruined cathedral in a golden glow. The Ronin lowered Winter's breath, a faint smile playing on his lips. The fight wasn't over, but he knew with absolute certainty that he was no longer fighting the darkness. He was fighting it. Chapter 5. Echoes of Acceptance. The silence that followed the Weaver's dissolution wasn't peaceful, not precisely. It was a thick, viscous quiet, saturated with the residue of centuries of torment, and a newly minted awareness of its own profound sadness. The air, still thick with ash, felt less aggressive, less actively hostile. Instead, it hummed with an undertone of regret, a palpable echo of the countless souls trapped within the Weaver's obsessive self-destruction. The Ronin, whose name he still hadn't given himself, felt oddly appropriate in the space, stood amidst the crumbling remains of the cathedral. Winter's breath, now resting in his hand, pulsed with a subdued warmth, no longer an aggressive flare of sunlight, but a steady, comforting ember. He hadn't returned to a victory, not in the conventional sense. Had dismantled a monstrous delusion, but the true battlefield remained within. He began to walk, not with the frantic urgency of a warrior, but with the slow deliberation of someone considering the weight of a fallen empire. His path led him through the heart of the Silent Fief, now bathed in the shifting hues of a bruised dawn. The corrupted constructs, still animated but stripped of the Weaver's fervent energy, lay scattered like grotesque, unfinished sculptures. They were not enemies to be vanquished, but reminders, grotesque testaments to a single consuming obsession. As he moved, he noticed a subtle change in the landscape. The mud, still clinging to the earth, began to recede, revealing patches of dark, fertile soil. Tiny shoots, resistant to the pervasive ash, pushed their way upwards, tentative green against the monochrome devastation. The cessation of the Weaver's influence, it seemed, wasn't merely a disruption of magic, it was a gradual, almost agonizing reclamation. He encountered pockets of survivors, a handful of villagers, gaunt and weary, huddled within the fractured walls of what remained of a farmstead. They regarded him with a guarded, almost superstitious awe. They had expected death, annihilation. Instead, they received a silence, a stillness, and a Ronin who simply watched, Winter's breath a silent sentinel. One woman, a withered elder named Lyra, approached him slowly, her movements hesitant. You did it," she said, her voice cracked with disuse and disbelief. "You ended him. But what now?" He didn't offer a grand pronouncement, a triumphant declaration. "There is nothing end," he replied, his voice soft, carrying the weight of his understanding. "Only to understand." He paused, allowing the words to settle. The Weaver was not a destroyer, but a prisoner of his own despair. Lyra stared at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. But the pain, the hunger, the screams? Those were not born of malice, he said gently. They were born of a desperate longing for meaning, for purpose, for a way to silence the voices within. He consumed souls, not to inflict suffering, but to fill a void that resided within himself, mirrored in the faces of those who looked upon him with fear. He pointed to one of the animated constructs, a particularly mangled figure of what might have been a blacksmith. "Look at it. It isn't driven by hatred. It's a reflection of the Weaver's own relentless pursuit, a futile attempt to find solace in a fractured reality." He spent the next few days with the villagers, not offering solutions or promises, but engaging in quiet observation. He didn't attempt to rebuild, to impose order. Instead, he helped them to tend to the emerging sprouts, to gather what little remained of their harvest. He showed them how to channel their grief, not into anger or despair, but into the simple act of nurturing life from the ashes. As he worked, he realized the true nature of his purpose. It wasn't about slaying demons, but about confronting the demons within himself, the temptation to impose control, the desire to eradicate suffering, the fear of chaos. The Weaver's destruction hadn't simply ended a threat. It had opened a space for a different kind of battle, a battle waged not with steel and magic, but with empathy and acceptance. Finally, as the sky bled into a deep indigo, he stood atop the ravaged spire of the cathedral, winter's breath raised once more. This time, he didn't aim it at a phantom enemy. Instead, he directed its light not outwards, but inwards, illuminating the faces of the villagers gathered below. "The silence isn't an end," he said, his voice carrying across the valley. "It is a beginning of listening, a beginning of acknowledging the inherent beauty and the inevitable sorrow of existence. There is no escape from suffering, but there is a way to meet it with grace." He lowered his blade, the light receding. The Ronin wasn't a savior, he realized. He was a witness. And in witnessing, in holding space for the pain and the hope, he understood that the last true battle wasn't against demons or sorcerer-priests, but against the darkest corners of the human heart. And in that understanding, he found not peace, but a profound, enduring purpose. Chapter 6. Echoes of the Weaver. The rain began subtly. A fine gray drizzle that clung to the ravaged stone of the cathedral spire, mirroring the dampness that had settled not just upon the valley, but within the Ronin himself. The villagers, initially a huddled mass of apprehensive faces, were now dispersing, their movements slow, deliberate, as if testing the solidity of the world after the Weaver's reign. A few remained, children mostly, their eyes wide with a nascent understanding of a reality far stranger than any they had known. He hadn't expected gratitude, nor, frankly, had he sought it. The act of wielding winter's breath, channeling the sun's imprisoned energy, felt less like a heroic act and more like a desperate, lonely ritual, a tether to something lost and perhaps eternally unattainable. The Weaver's destruction had been a Pyrrhic victory, a dismantling of a malignant force, yes, but also a dissolution of something profoundly unsettling, a solidified certainty about the nature of evil. As the last of the villagers retreated, a young woman, no older than 20, stepped forward. Her name was Alara, and she'd been one of the first to arrive, clutching a ragged doll, a silent testament to a childhood stolen by the Weaver's influence. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, a residue of the resilience the Ronin had sought to cultivate. "You spoke of silence," she said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. "Of listening. But the silence remains, doesn't it? It's heavy, like the bones of the dead." He didn't respond immediately. He stood, a silhouette against the fading twilight, and simply observed her. He recognized the disquiet in her eyes, the ingrained reflex to seek answers where there were only echoes. He understood now that the true battle wasn't about vanquishing external threats, but about confronting the lingering residue of trauma, the insidious tendrils of fear and loss that had taken root in the collective psyche of the valley. "Silence is not an absence," he finally said, his voice deeper, imbued with the weariness of countless battles fought and lost. "It is a space for what remains. And within that space, there is always a current of memory, of grief, of potential." He paused, allowing his words to settle. The Weaver thrived on suppressing that current, on channeling it into corruption. We must learn to acknowledge its flow, to guide it, rather than to dam it. He gestured towards the charred remains of the cathedral. "Look at this. It was once a place of worship, of community, of solace. Now it's a testament to destruction. But even in destruction, there is a seed. The soil remains fertile, capable of nurturing new growth, though perhaps not the growth we initially envisioned. Elara approached cautiously, examining a patch of blackened earth where the altar had once stood. She knelt, gently brushing away the ash with a trembling hand. "But what if the seed is poisonous?" she whispered, her voice laced with a profound sadness. "Then we tend to the soil," he replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We add compost, water, patience. We don't simply abandon it. The greatest demons aren't born of magic or corruption, Elara. They are born of apathy, of denial. They thrive on our refusal to confront the uncomfortable truths within ourselves." He stepped closer, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of Winter's breath, not to threaten, but to offer a tangible symbol of his philosophy, a quiet strength amidst the pervasive gloom. "You speak of the inherent beauty and inevitable sorrow of existence. Those are not mutually exclusive concepts. Beauty can be found in the fragility of a blossom pushing through cracked earth. Sorrow can be found in the shared experience of loss. To deny one is to deny the other." He began to slowly, deliberately, move the ash with Winter's breath, not to cleanse, but to reveal. As the concentrated sunlight touched the soil, a faint green shoot emerged, delicate and tenacious. It wasn't a vibrant, flourishing plant, but a tiny, vulnerable sprout. "This," he said, his voice barely a murmur, "is a beginning. It is a reminder that even after the most devastating storms, life persists. It demands nothing from us. It simply is." Elara watched, mesmerized. Tears welled in her eyes, not of grief, but of something akin to hope. I don't understand," she confessed, her voice thick with emotion. "I spent my life trying to eradicate the darkness. I thought that was the only way." He sheathed Winter's breath, the faint pulse of sunlight receding. "The only way to truly vanquish darkness," he said, turning to face her fully, "is to acknowledge its presence, to understand its origins, and most importantly, to refuse to be consumed by it." He extended his hand, offering a simple gesture of comfort. "The battle continues, Elara, but it's no longer a fight against monsters. It's a fight for the soul of this place, and perhaps for a little piece of our own." Chapter 7. Echoes of Reflection. The silence that descended after the Weaver's demise was heavier than the ash that choked the Silent Fief. It wasn't a comfortable quiet, born of victory, but a profound stillness, laden with the weight of what had been, and perhaps what could still be. Elara remained rooted to the spot, the nascent green shoot a fragile beacon in the oppressive gloom, a stark contrast to the devastation surrounding them. The Ronin, whose name remained unspoken, simply stood, his silhouette etched against the slowly brightening sky, a solitary figure of quiet intensity. "You speak of reflection," Elara finally said, her voice husky with disuse and a nascent understanding. "Not of understanding the darkness, but of accepting it." He nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the tiny sprout. "The Weaver didn't create this place from malice, Elara. He was a wound, a desperate attempt to knit together the shattered remnants of a faith, warped by sorrow and a hunger for control. The souls he consumed weren't just fuel, they were echoes of what had been lost, of desires unfulfilled, of the unbearable weight of regret. His magic wasn't born of darkness, but of an unbearable need for connection, a twisted imitation of healing." He shifted, the movement of his katana a subtle, almost meditative ritual. Every act of destruction, every attempt to erase the past, merely compounds the pain. To truly combat the void, you must confront the source of its genesis, not with force, but with a willingness to acknowledge the rot within. Elara walked towards the sprout, kneeling carefully to avoid disturbing its delicate roots. She traced the outline of a leaf with a trembling finger. "It's remarkably resilient," Despite everything. Resilience isn't about enduring destruction, the Ronin said, his voice low and measured. It's about the capacity to begin again, even when everything around you has been reduced to ash. The Weaver sought to extinguish that, to deny the possibility of growth. He believed that the only acceptable state was one of frozen despair. He paused, a flicker of something akin to sadness crossing his features. I've seen this pattern countless times. The desperate clinging to a single flawed truth, believing it the only key to salvation. It's a trap, Ilara. A beautiful, seductive trap. Gardening. The air began to shift subtly, a barely perceptible ripple in the oppressive atmosphere. A localized patch of the ash seemed to darken, thickening around the sprout as if instinctively seeking to smother its nascent life. It was a mirror of the Weaver's attempt to consume the valley, a ghostly echo of his destructive intent. This isn't just about the Weaver, Ilara whispered, her eyes fixed on the encroaching darkness. It's about our own darkness. The darkness we try to hide, to deny, to demonize. The Ronin raised a hand and Winter's breath pulsed again, this time not with an aggressive burst of sunlight, but with a gentle, sustained warmth. The localized darkness receded, the ash thinning, allowing the sprout to bask in the renewed glow. The greatest battles are not fought against external forces, he said, his voice gaining a quiet strength. They are fought within. The Weaver's influence wasn't rooted in the soil, it was rooted in the hearts of those who succumbed to fear and despair. We too are susceptible to that corruption. To truly defeat the darkness, we must first conquer the shadows within ourselves. He turned to face Ilara fully, his expression unreadable. You sought to eradicate the darkness, and in doing so, you became a part of it. The desire to control, to impose your will upon the world, is a powerful engine of destruction. It creates the very void you sought to vanquish. But how? Ilara asked, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. How can I fight something that's fundamentally? He stepped closer, and for the first time, she noticed the subtle lines etched around his eyes, the marks of countless battles, not just with demons, but with his own demons. By recognizing it, by acknowledging its existence without judgment, by accepting its power, not by trying to eradicate it. The blade doesn't destroy Ilara. It guides. It allows the darkness to flow through you, and ultimately, to dissipate. He gestured towards Winter's breath. It's not about wielding power, it's about becoming a conduit for something greater. He offered her his hand, not as a gesture of comfort, but of transference. This isn't a core, Ilara. It's a beginning, a fragile, uncertain beginning. But it's a beginning, nonetheless. As she took his hand, the faint pulse of sunlight from the blade seemed to flow into her, not as a cleansing force, but as a quiet understanding. She felt a profound shift within her, a loosening of the rigid defenses she had built around her heart. The tears, no longer of grief, flowed freely, a testament to the recognition of a truth she had spent her entire life avoiding. The fight for the soul of the fief, she realized, was inextricably linked to the fight for her own. Chapter 8. Echoes in the Iron. The rain had ceased, leaving the Silent Fief coated in a slick, gray film. It wasn't a cleansing rain, Ilara realized, but one of sorrow, mirroring the dampness that clung to her bones. The air still held the residual tang of decay, a ghostly perfume of the Weaver's corruption. But it was subtly diluted, thinner now that the sorcerer was gone. She stood at the base of the iron tower, the silence a heavy blanket, punctuated only by the rhythmic drip of water from shattered archways. The Ronin, whose name she still hadn't dared to utter, was already ascending the spiraling steps, Winter's breath a beacon of pale light in the oppressive gloom. You said it's a beginning, Elara called out, her voice raspy with disuse. "But it feels precarious, like stepping onto a precipice." He didn't respond immediately, simply continued his ascent, each measured step deliberate and imbued with an unsettling grace. Finally, he paused, turning to face her, the sunlight reflecting off the blade, creating a brief, almost painful flare of brilliance. "Precipices are inherent in beginnings, Elara," he said, his voice a low rumble, devoid of sentiment. "They represent the unknown, the potential for both fall and elevation. To attempt to avoid them is to deny the very nature of change." He moved closer, his shadow stretching long and distorted in the fading light. The air around him felt colder, not from the rain, but from the sheer weight of his experience. The Weaver wasn't simply a monster of destruction. He was a reflection, a culmination of the desires for control that fester within every soul, magnified and given form. Elara shifted uncomfortably. The notion of a reflection, of her own darkness being the catalyst for his struggle, was profoundly unsettling. It felt like a condemnation, a confirmation of her deepest fears. But how can I even to understand that? How do I confront something so fundamental, so intrinsically? He gestured with Winter's breath, the movement fluid and practiced. "It's not about confronting it head-on, Elara. That is the mistake. Confrontation breeds resistance, strengthens the thing you seek to overcome. You must understand that the desire to control, to impose your will upon the world, is a powerful engine of destruction. It creates the very void you sought to vanquish." His words hung in the air, heavy with an unspoken truth. She stared at the blade, at the way the light danced on its surface, and a chilling realization began to dawn. The patterns of her own obsessive behavior, her relentless pursuit of order and certainty, her fear of chaos, they weren't merely anxieties. They were echoes of the Weaver's influence. "But how?" Elara asked, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "How can I fight something that's fundamentally—" He stepped closer, and for the first time, she noticed the subtle lines etched around his eyes, the marks of countless battles, not just with demons, but with his own demons. By recognizing it, by acknowledging its existence without judgment, by accepting its power, not by trying to eradicate it. The blade doesn't destroy, Elara. It guides. It allows the darkness to flow through you, and ultimately to dissipate. He gestured towards Winter's breath. "It's not about wielding power, it's about becoming a conduit for something greater." He offered her his hand, not as a gesture of comfort, but of transference. "This isn't a cure, Elara. It's a beginning. A fragile, uncertain beginning, but it's a beginning nonetheless." As she took his hand, the faint pulse of sunlight from the blade seemed to flow into her, not as a cleansing force, but as a quiet understanding. She felt a profound shift within her, a loosening of the rigid defenses she had built around her heart. The tears, no longer of grief, flowed freely, a testament to the recognition of a truth she had spent her entire life avoiding. The fight for the soul of the fief, she realized, was inextricably linked to the fight for her own. "You've touched me," she said, her voice raw. I feel different." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "The blade doesn't heal wounds, Elara. It exposes them, revealing the path to true resolution. The process will be arduous, painful even. There will be moments when you feel as though you are drowning in the darkness. But you must hold on to the light, no matter how faint." He paused, studying her face. The Weaver wasn't defeated simply by destroying his form. He was neutralized by acknowledging his reflection within you. The key is not to suppress the dark impulses, but to understand their source, to channel their energy into something constructive. A task akin to taming a storm, not extinguishing it. He turned back to the tower, continuing his ascent. "Come," he called out, his voice carrying clearly on the wind. "Let us see if this beginning can endure." Elara followed, her hand still resting lightly on the hilt of Winter's breath. The darkness of the Silent Fief pressed in on her, but it no longer felt entirely hostile. It felt familiar, and, perhaps, with a sliver of terrifying hope, it felt like a starting point. Chapter 9. Echoes in the Mire. The ascent of the Iron Tower was a descent into something profoundly unsettling. The air thickened with the residue of the Void Weaver's power, a viscous, clinging humidity that tasted of rust and regret. Elara's initial disorientation hadn't entirely dissipated. She found herself acutely aware of the lingering echoes of the battle, the screams of the constructs, the palpable weight of the sorcerer's malice. The Ronin, whom she had begun to instinctively call Kaito, moved with a disconcerting grace, a predator navigating a landscape saturated with his prey's despair. "The architecture here, it's not simply decaying," Kaito observed, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very stone. "It's actively resisting." The Weaver wasn't merely an occupant, he became woven into the bones of this place, feeding on the structure's inherent sorrow. They navigated spiraling corridors, walls slick with a black, oily substance that pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence. The remains of the villagers, twisted into grotesque effigies, a mother clutching a child-shaped shard of obsidian, a blacksmith frozen mid-strike, a scholar forever hunched over a crumbling tome, were scattered throughout, silent witnesses to the Weaver's artistry of suffering. Elara felt a rising tide of nausea, not just from the environment, but from the sheer, concentrated bleakness of their existence. "He took their stories," she finally said, the words heavy with a sense of profound loss. "He didn't just kill them. He erased them." Kaito stopped before a particularly intricate carving, a young girl, her face frozen in a silent, accusing stare. The Weaver specializes in extracting memories, translating them into raw magical energy. He built his power on the stolen identities of an entire generation. And he still continues. This tower, this entire fief, is a repository of his thefts. He tapped the carving with the pommel of Winter's breath. That's why destroying him wasn't enough. It was a wound that needed to be understood. They reached a chamber dominated by a massive cracked mirror, its surface swirling with chaotic energy. This, Kaito explained, was the nexus point of the Weaver's influence, a place where he had solidified his reflection, the darkest impulses of the valley's tormented souls. "This isn't just a mirror," he said, his hand hovering over the warped surface. "It's a wound, a perpetual, echoing wound. To truly neutralize him, we need to interact with it, not with force, but with empathy." Elara hesitated. The air in the chamber throbbed with a dizzy intensity, and she felt a tugging sensation, as if something was attempting to pull her into the mirror's depths. The experience was overwhelmingly unsettling, a barrage of fragmented memories and agonizing emotions, a screaming child, a broken promise, a desperate plea for salvation. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice strained. "Reflecting," Kaito responded, his movements precise and deliberate. He drew Winter's breath, and the blade pulsed with an unnerving light as he approached the mirror. He didn't attack. Instead, he held the blade before the swirling surface, allowing the energy from the blade to wash over the mirror. It wasn't a violent confrontation, it felt almost conversant. The Weaver thrives on denial, on the refusal to acknowledge the darkness within, he murmured, his face etched with concentration. The mirror is a concentrated version of that denial. We must confront it, not with judgment, but with understanding. As Kaito continued, the chaotic energy in the chamber began to shift. The swirling patterns in the mirror slowed, coalescing into recognizable shapes, the faces of the villagers, their eyes filled with a profound sadness, but also now a glimmer of acceptance. Elara saw her own face reflected amongst them, haunted, yes, but not entirely consumed by despair. Suddenly, a wave of agonizing pain ripped through her, a searing echo of the Weaver's final curse. She cried out, collapsing to her knees. Kaito moved instantly, shielding her with his body. Winter's breath held aloft. "Hold on to the light," he urged, his voice strained. "Don't let the darkness consume you." The pain subsided, replaced by a chilling realization. The Weaver wasn't just an external force, he was a fractured fragment of herself. The rage, the bitterness, the ingrained sense of self-loathing, they were all part of her, manifested and amplified by the Weaver's influence. He knelt beside her, his hand gently resting on her arm. "This isn't about fighting the Weaver," he said softly. "It's about accepting the battles you've fought within yourself. The acceptance allows you to release the darkness and destroy it." As Elara looked at Kaito, she understood. The fight for the fief was not an external conflict. It was a mirror reflecting her own soul, demanding she confront the shadows she had so diligently hidden. The journey ahead would be long, arduous, and undoubtedly painful, but for the first time, she felt a strange sense of quiet resolve. The light was faint, but it was there, a fragile ember within the encroaching darkness, and she, finally, was ready to tend to it. Chapter 10. Echoes in the Ash. The sun, though still obscured by the perpetual twilight, seemed to hold a different quality now, a tentative warmth that settled on Elara's skin. Kaito's words, spoken with a weary tenderness, resonated within her, a slow, deliberate unraveling of the tightly wound knot of her despair. The agony hadn't vanished entirely. A dull throb remained, a ghost of the Weaver's curse, but it was no longer a screaming, consuming force. It was manageable, a reminder rather than a threat. "It's unsettling, isn't it?" Kaito said, breaking the silence, his voice low, considering. He was meticulously cleaning Winter's breath with a worn cloth, the rhythmic scrape a counterpoint to the lingering dread. "To realize the greatest battles aren't fought with steel, but with the echoes within ourselves." Elara nodded, unable to articulate the complex shift within her. She examined her hands, still tingling with residual energy, and noticed a slight shift in the color of her skin, a faint luminescence, mirroring the gentle pulse of the katana. It was a disconcerting transformation, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "I spent so long believing I was a victim," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper, "that the Weaver was some external malignancy, a force I had to overcome through strength and aggression. It was a comfortable lie, wasn't it? Easier than acknowledging the rot that had taken root within." Kaito ceased his cleaning and turned to her, his face etched with a profound understanding. "Comfort is the enemy of growth, Elara. It's the soil in which despair flourishes. The Weaver didn't create you, he amplified a potential already dormant within you. The bitterness, the anger, they are not flaws, but the consequence of a life lived in quiet judgment, in self-imposed exile." He paused, choosing his words with the careful precision of a master craftsman. "He fed on your unresolved pain, yes, but he also offered a distorted reflection of your own self-destructive tendencies. He was a mirror, and you, perhaps unconsciously, were choosing to stare into the darkest depths." They spent the next hour in a quiet contemplation, moving slowly through the ravaged remains of the Iron Tower. The air still thrummed with the lingering residue of the Weaver's magic, a palpable sense of decay. Elara, guided by Kaito's calm presence, began to consciously acknowledge the feelings she had so desperately tried to bury: the resentment towards her family, the shame of her past failures, the relentless self-doubt that had gnawed at her for years. It was a painful process, like peeling back layers of hardened skin, but with each admitted fragment of truth, the lingering pain diminished. Kaito, observing her with unwavering focus, occasionally offered a word of guidance, a gentle prod towards self-reflection. He didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. His wisdom lay in his ability to hold a space for her, a space where she could confront her darkness without judgment. As the last vestiges of twilight retreated, leaving the valley bathed in a bruised indigo light, they reached the summit of the tower. The view was devastatingly beautiful, a panorama of twisted landscapes, skeletal trees reaching towards a perpetually clouded sky, and the silent, corrupted monuments to the Void Weaver's victims. But for the first time since entering the Silent Fief, Elara didn't feel overwhelmed by despair. Instead, she felt a strange sense of detachment, a serene acceptance of the devastation. "You've done well, Elara," Kaito said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "You've begun to dismantle the fortress you built around yourself. But the work is far from over." He held out Winter's breath, the blade still faintly glowing with captured sunlight. "This isn't just a weapon, Elara. It's a tool. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is still light to be found, and the strength to wield it." Elara took the katana, the cool metal settling into her hand. The familiar weight felt comforting, a tangible connection to the ancient discipline that flowed through her veins. As she looked out over the desolate landscape, she realized that the true battle wasn't about destroying the Weaver or his constructs. It was about becoming the warrior she was always meant to be, a beacon of light in a world consumed by shadows. "There are others," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Villages still clinging to life, trapped in this nightmare. We need to reach them, to offer them not just protection, but the chance to confront their own demons." Kaito nodded, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "Indeed. The echoes of the Weaver will always be with us, but they no longer hold dominion. We will not simply eradicate them, we will learn to coexist with them, to transform them into lessons." He sheathed Winter's breath with a grace born of years of experience. "Let us begin." Chapter 11. Echoes of the Weaver. The wind, perpetually stained the color of rust and regret, carried the scent of ash and something older, something akin to burnt bone and forgotten prayers. It was a familiar fragrance now, the pervasive signature of the Silent Fief, and Elara found herself unconsciously adjusting her posture, anticipating the next tremor of corrupted magic, the next surge of the Weaver's influence. Kaito, ever observant, noticed her tension. "You're anticipating the worst, Elara," he stated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the fractured stone of the ruined chapel where they'd established their temporary camp. "A dangerous habit. Fear is a weapon the Weaver readily utilizes." Elara shifted Winter's breath, the katana's weight a grounding presence against the unsettling symphony of the valley. "It's difficult not to." The erupted, like a held note of pure malice. "Resonance is not malice, but an echo," Kaito corrected gently. "The Weaver didn't simply this. He amplified what already existed, the fear, the despair, the unresolved grief. To combat him, you must understand that echo, not be consumed by it." He picked up a shard of obsidian fallen from the tower, a remnant of the Weaver's defenses, and turned it over in his fingers. "This wasn't born from nothing, you see. It's a solidified version of someone's shattered hope." They moved on, Kaito leading the way with a quiet, measured pace. They were heading towards Oakhaven, the last truly functional village clinging to the southern edge of the Fief, a community of roughly 80 souls, haunted by a palpable sorrow and a strange, unwavering belief in the Weaver's eventual redemption. The villagers, a weary but resolute lot, had initially greeted them with suspicion, their eyes holding a guarded mix of fear and a desperate yearning for deliverance. The approach to Oakhaven was a slow, agonizing process. The air thickened with the weaver's influence, not with violent outbursts, but with a pervasive dampness that clung to the skin and a subtle distortion of light. The villagers themselves weren't actively hostile, but they were distant. Their movements were slow, almost ritualistic, their conversations fragmented, riddled with pronouncements about appeasing the silent god and the necessary sacrifice required for peace. Ilara, with Kaito's support, quickly discerned the source of their paralysis. The village elder, Silas, a man etched with the deep lines of hardship and a frightening serenity, was the key. He was subtly, masterfully, feeding the weaver's influence through a network of carefully orchestrated rituals, convinced that only by offering himself, and potentially others, would the valley's suffering end. He believes he's protecting them, Kaito explained, his voice grim as he observed Silas conducting a meager offering of woven reeds and dried herbs in the center of the village square. His traded agency for a false sense of security. "He's a puppet," Ilara stated, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Perhaps," Kaito conceded, "but a powerful one. His influence extends into every corner of this village. To dismantle it, we must not attack his beliefs, but expose the lies that underpin them." The confrontation wasn't a clash of steel or a torrent of magic. It was a quiet unraveling. Ilara, guided by Kaito's subtle prompting, didn't directly challenge Salas' pronouncements. Instead, she began to speak of the sun, of the brief, fleeting moments when its light pierced through the perpetual haze, a reminder of a world beyond the weaver's dominion. She spoke of the resilience of the human spirit, of the importance of fighting for one's own destiny, not surrendering it to despair. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with the danger of triggering a full-blown surge of weaver's power. Several times, the air shimmered with corrupted energy, forcing Kaito to intervene, his movements precise and deadly, disrupting the nascent rituals before they could fully manifest. Finally, after hours of quiet conversation and carefully placed observations, a flicker of doubt appeared in Silas' eyes. He hesitated, a single, almost imperceptible movement, as Ilara described the sensation of warmth on her skin, the feeling of standing in the sunlight. "The weaver does not offer peace," she finished, her voice clear and unwavering. "He offers oblivion. True peace comes from confronting our fears, from choosing to fight, not to surrender." The effect was immediate. The villagers, jolted from their trance-like state, began to question Silas, to examine the foundations of their beliefs. The air, though still thick with the residue of the weaver's influence, began to lighten. The shadows seemed to shrink, yielding to the nascent promise of dawn. Kaito placed a hand on Ilara's shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the battle fought and won. "Juve reminded them that they are not echoes," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Juve given them back their voices. Now, the true work begins." The silence of the Silent Fief, Ilara realized, wasn't the absence of sound, but the weight of unspoken histories, of forgotten hopes, of the lingering resonance of a dark god. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a solitary warrior battling a monstrous force. She felt like a gardener, tending to a wounded soul. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Stone. The sunrise, tentative and bruised, didn't offer the triumphant brilliance of a completed victory. Instead, it was a hesitant blush on the perpetually gray sky, a suggestion of warmth swallowed almost immediately by the clinging ash. The Silent Fief, still slick with a film of dark residue, possessed a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the held breath of a wounded thing. Kaito remained rooted to the base of the warped iron tower, his katana, winter's breath, gleaming faintly in the newly risen light. He hadn't moved since the dissolution of the Void Weaver, an unsettling stillness that mirrored the unsettling calm settling over the villagers. He wasn't celebrating, not in any conventional sense. The fight had stripped him bare, revealed the brittle strength of his resolve alongside the deep, abiding loneliness he'd carried for so long. Elara knelt beside him, examining the skeletal remains of the Weaver's tower. The iron was pitted and blackened, not just by the decay of age, but by the corrosive influence of the sorcerer's magic. She traced a finger along a groove, etched deep into the stone, a mark, perhaps, of the Weaver's agonizing final moments. "It's sobering," she said, her voice quiet. "To think of a being so consumed by corruption, feeding on such vast despair. It wasn't simply malice. It was a desperate clinging to existence, fueled by the absence of anything truly vital." Kaito grunted, a sound of acknowledgement. He hadn't spoken since the Weaver's demise, finding the need for words clumsy against the profound weight of the event. Head observed Elara shift, the subtle softening in her usually steel-gray eyes, the tentative curiosity she was extending toward the villagers. He understood her role, but the impulse to simply vanish, to continue his solitary path, remained a stubborn undercurrent. "The villagers are awakening," she observed, gesturing towards a small group gathered below, their faces etched with confusion and a nascent understanding. "Silas is attempting to guide them. It's a delicate process." "He was a husk," Kaito stated, the observation more a statement of fact than a judgment. "A vessel filled with a single poisonous thought. Removing the vessel doesn't necessarily heal the wound." Elara nodded, her gaze distant. "You're right. It's not enough to simply eradicate the source of the corruption. We have to tend to the soil, nourish the roots." She rose, her movements deliberate, and began to address the villagers, her voice gaining strength with each sentence. She didn't preach, didn't offer easy answers. Instead, she posed questions about their memories, their fears, their understanding of what had happened. She spoke of the importance of remembrance, not as a burden, but as a foundation for rebuilding. "The Weaver didn't create this despair," she said, her eyes meeting those of a young woman who had been among the first to fall under his influence. "He merely amplified what was already present, the fear of the unknown, the loneliness, the regret. We must acknowledge these shadows, confront them, and refuse to let them consume us." As she spoke, the villagers responded, not with fervent agreement, but with thoughtful questioning. A farmer, whose family had been decimated by the Weaver's constructs, voiced his grief, his anger, his desperate need for closure. A young boy, still haunted by the distorted faces of the reanimated horrors, asked about the nature of death, about what lay beyond the veil. Kaito watched, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of Winter's breath. He realized that Elara's approach wasn't a simple restoration, it was an excavation. She wasn't trying to erase the past, but to understand it, to integrate its lessons into the present. "There's a resonance here," he said, finally breaking his silence. "The Weaver's influence is still layered, like a palisade of sorrow built over centuries. We must dismantle it, stone by stone." Elara turned to him, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "You see it too. It's not just the immediate devastation, it's the echoes of pain, the collective trauma that the Weaver exploited." He nodded, a slow, acknowledging movement. He knew that the true battle hadn't been fought with steel and light, but with empathy and understanding. Had been so focused on wielding his techniques, on executing the ancient rituals, that he had almost missed the fundamental truth that the greatest monsters weren't born of magic, but of the human heart. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the Silent Fief, Kaito knew his journey was far from over. He would remain a silent guardian, a shadow in the twilight, until he was sure that the seeds of hope had taken root. He would continue to watch, to guide, not with force, but with a quiet, unwavering presence, a last Ronin, not just fighting a demon god, but confronting the ghosts within himself. Chapter 13. Echoes in the Iron. The air in the tower room hung thick with the residue of the Weaver's final assault, not just with the clinging scent of decaying energy, but with a deeper, more unsettling aroma, the metallic tang of shattered faith, the earthy musk of prolonged despair. Sunlight, fractured and weak, pierced the warped iron latticework, casting jagged, unsettling patterns across the dust-covered floor. Kaito moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, his scarred katana, winter's breath, a shimmering presence in the gloom. He wasn't simply patrolling, he was absorbing. Ilara, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a newfound intensity, remained by the shattered remnants of the sorcerer's throne. She wasn't actively searching for traces of magic, as she had done before, but meticulously documenting the debris, the fractured ceramic shards, the warped metal, the remnants of the incantations carved into the iron. The Weaver wasn't merely a sorcerer, she murmured, her voice low and thoughtful. He was a collector. He collected not just souls, but the of suffering. Kaito understood the unsettling logic behind her observation. The Weaver hadn't just created the horrors of the Silent Fief, had amplified them, feeding on the lingering grief, the unspoken regrets, the unfulfilled promises that clung to the valley like the perpetual twilight. It was a parasitic relationship, one that had poisoned the very soil. The gatekeeper's severance was insufficient, he admitted, his voice a low rumble. He traced the faint luminescence still pulsing within the katana's blade. I focused on disrupting his magical signature, but I failed to address the core of his power, the accumulated agony. The energy I severed was a symptom, not the disease. Ilara nodded, carefully placing a fragment of a shattered amulet into a small leather-bound journal. You glimpsed the truth, Kaito. The sorcerer wasn't from the grief him. He was the manifestation of a valley steeped in sorrow, given form and destructive purpose. A profound weariness settled over Kaito. The battle had taken more than just physical wounds. It had stripped away a layer of his own carefully constructed defenses, forcing him to confront the chilling realization that his techniques, however honed, were ultimately reactive. They addressed the symptoms of a much deeper, more insidious problem, the corrosive nature of unresolved trauma. He knelt, examining the floor where the Weaver had collapsed. The iron was stained with a viscous gray substance that seemed to absorb the light. There's a resonance here, a lingering vibration. It's not just residual magic. It's psychic imprint. The screams of the villagers, the whispered prayers of the damned, the Weaver's own anguish solidified into this very stone. He extended a hand, his palm hovering inches above the stain. It's like trying to decipher a lost language, a language written not in symbols but in suffering. Ilara approached, cautiously observing his movements. Perhaps the key isn't destruction but purification. Not simply erasing the Weaver's influence, but transforming it. We need to find a way to absorb the pain, to integrate it, to transform it into something constructive. The idea was unsettling, bordering on blasphemous. To actively engage with the Weaver's dark legacy felt like inviting further corruption. Yet, Kaito recognized the inherent wisdom in her suggestion. The Weaver hadn't created evil, had weaponized despair. And the most potent weapon against despair was often empathy. He rose, his movements slow and deliberate. It requires a delicate balance. We cannot merely absorb the pain, we must process it, understand it, and ultimately transcend it. He glanced up at the fractured sunlight filtering through the tower's walls. Perhaps we can use the energy of the sun, the very force that fueled winter's breath, to burn away the corrupted residue. Ilara considered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. A channeling ritual, focused on transformation, not destruction. It's ambitious but not impossible. She retrieved a collection of smooth, gray stones she had gathered earlier, remnants of the weaver's constructs. "I've been studying the patterns of the Earth's magnetic field here. There's a distinct current, a subtle flow of energy that seems to be resistant to the weaver's influence. Perhaps we can harness that current, amplify it, and use it to transmute the pain." As they began to prepare a makeshift ritual space, Kaito realized something profound. This wasn't just about slaying demons or wielding ancient techniques. It was about confronting the darkness within himself, the echoes of his own past regrets and failures. The Silent Fief wasn't just a place of devastation, it was a mirror, reflecting the potential for darkness that lay dormant within all sentient beings. He would continue to be a shadow, a guardian, but now, he understood. He was also an architect tasked not just with protecting others from the horrors of the past, but with guiding them towards a future free from the tyranny of sorrow. Chapter 14. Echoes in the Stone. The air and the ritual space. A flattened circle carved into the muddy floor of the ruined chapel, still thrummed with the residual energy of the battle. The scent of burnt wood and ozone lingered, a bitter perfume clinging to the crumbling stonework. Elara meticulously arranged the gray stones around the perimeter, her movements deliberate, almost reverent. Each stone was a shard of the Void Weaver's creations, meticulously catalogued and analyzed. Kaito, meanwhile, stood before a crude altar constructed from salvaged iron, winter's breath resting in its center, its faint sunlight pulse steady, a defiant beacon in the pervasive gloom. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick with potential, a held breath before a storm. It had been days since the Weaver's demise, days filled with a disquieting realization. The victory hadn't brought release, but an unsettling deepening of the mystery. The Weaver hadn't simply been a monster, he was a symptom, a grotesque manifestation of a corruption that ran far deeper, interwoven with the very fabric of this desolate land. The magnetic field, it's not merely resistant, Kaito, Elara said, her voice low, almost hesitant. She ran a calloused hand over one of the stones, tracing its jagged edges. "It's absorbing. It's drawing the lingering echoes of the Weaver's magic into itself, attempting to reconfigure them." Kaito nodded slowly, as if the earth itself is trying to heal a wound that refuses to close. "We've been focused on destruction, on burning away the corruption. But perhaps true eradication lies in understanding the process of healing." He adjusted his grip on Winter's breath, the familiar weight a grounding presence. Had initially been driven by a primal need to cleanse, to avenge. Now, a more complex understanding was taking root, a recognition that violence, however righteous, was merely a temporary solution, a band-aid on a gaping wound. "The gatekeeper's severance," he murmured, the technique echoing in his mind's eye, was never intended as a weapon of pure annihilation. It was a key to unlocking a different potential, the potential for transformation. He recalled the raw, terrifying power had channeled, the way it had momentarily transcended the limitations of his physical form. It wasn't simply about bypassing the Weaver's defenses, it was about tapping into something older, something resonant. "You're suggesting we use the stones, the Earth's magnetic field, as conduits," Elara said, her eyes fixed on the altar, "to actively guide the corrupted energy back into a state of equilibrium, to reshape it." "Precisely," Kaito confirmed. "Winter's breath isn't just a weapon. It's a focus, a focal point for the sunlight's inherent restorative power. If we can channel that energy through the Earth's current, amplify it, and direct it through the stones, we might be able to rewrite the Weaver's influence, not destroy it." He began to perform the preparatory steps of the ritual, his movements precise and measured. He wasn't simply enacting a technique, he was speaking to the land, acknowledging its suffering, attempting to forge a connection. The air grew noticeably colder, the faint sunlight intensifying as Winter's breath began to hum with a palpable energy. The gray stones resonated with a subtle vibration, mirroring the rising power. "Elara," observing his movements, adjusted the placement of several stones, subtly altering the flow of the magnetic current. "The resonance is increasing," she noted. Her brow furrowed. "The patterns are shifting. It's responding to our intention." Suddenly, a high-pitched whine filled the chapel, a sound that seemed to penetrate directly into Kaito's bones. The runes carved into the altar began to glow with an unsettling violet light. He instinctively braced himself, channeling his energy, anchoring himself to the present. "The Weaver's essence hasn't truly dissipated," he said, his voice strained. "It's lingering, fragmented. It's attempting to reassert itself, to hijack the ritual." He raised Winter's breath, the blade blazing with a blinding white light. He wasn't attacking, he was containing. He poured his spirit into the blade, weaving a shield of pure energy around the ritual space, a fragile barrier against the returning darkness. "It's fighting us, Kaito," Elara shouted over the escalating whine. "It's feeding on our efforts, attempting to corrupt the transformation." Kaito focused his mind, drawing upon the memories of his training, the lessons etched into his soul. He visualized the stone's core, its ancient energy, not as a tool for destruction, but as a vessel for renewal. He intensified his focus, channeling the sunlight through Winter's breath, directing it not outwards, but inwards towards the stones, towards the wounded earth. With a final, desperate surge of energy, he executed the gatekeeper's severance, not as a strike, but as an offering, a precise, deliberate release of spiritual force. The violet light intensified, then abruptly vanished. The whine ceased. The runes faded. Silence descended once more, heavier this time, laden with a profound sense of relief and something else, anticipation. Kaito lowered Winter's breath, his body trembling with exhaustion. "It's quiet," he said, his voice hoarse. Elara knelt beside the altar, examining the stones. "The patterns, they've changed," she murmured, her expression unreadable. "They're no longer fragmented. They're integrated. The Weaver's influence isn't gone, but it's contained, transmuted." He looked at the stones, no longer simply shards of a fallen empire, but echoes of a possibility, a terrifying, exhilarating possibility that perhaps, after centuries of darkness, a glimmer of light could truly take root. The journey was far from over, but for the first time since entering the Silent Fief, Kaito felt a fragile, burgeoning sense of hope. He was not just a warrior, nor a guardian, but a conduit, a channel for a nascent, unsettlingly beautiful future. Chapter 15. Echoes in Stone. The silence in the heart of the Silent Fief wasn't peaceful. It was a taut, expectant stillness, a held breath before a storm. Kaito, leaning heavily against the weathered stone of the altar, felt the residue of the Weaver's power clinging to him like a shroud, a reminder of the raw, chaotic force had just wrestled into submission. The air thrummed with a low frequency, not of magic, but of potential, a disconcerting, almost organic vibration. Elara, her face etched with an unnerving concentration, continued her examination of the altar stones. The violet light that had erupted during the gatekeeper's severance had faded, leaving behind a subtle sheen to the granite, an almost iridescent quality that hinted at a fundamental shift within the stone itself. She traced a finger across a particularly intricate rune, one that had previously pulsed with a sickly purple glow, now displaying a muted, pulsating teal. "The energy signature is complex," she said, her voice low, almost reverent. "It's not merely neutralized, Kaito. It's hybridized. The Weaver's essence has been integrated, woven into the fabric of this place. It's less a corruption, more a seed planted in fertile ground." Kaito nodded, acknowledging the unsettling truth. Had always approached the Weaver as a singular entity, a malignant force to be eradicated. Now, he realized, the Weaver wasn't gone. It was fractured, dispersed, subtly reshaping the environment around them. He felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being observed not by malevolent intent, but by something infinitely more insidious, the patient, deliberate unfolding of a new order. The runes aren't just containing it, Elara continued, her gaze sweeping across the crumbling tower. They're reflecting the Weaver's influence back upon itself, reconfiguring it. She paused, a thoughtful frown creasing her brow. It's as if he's attempting to understand the very act of his own destruction, to learn from it. He recalled the initial surge of agony as he channeled the severance, the agonizing pressure against his spirit, the almost unbearable awareness of the Weaver's horrified consciousness. It hadn't been a simple annihilation. It had been an encounter, a brutal, unsettling dialogue with a being of pure, distilled chaos. We have to understand how this integration is occurring, Kaito said, pushing himself upright, the weight of his armor feeling heavier than ever. The sun, a bruised apricot through the perpetual haze, offered little comfort. If the Weaver's influence continues to reshape this valley, we risk becoming puppets in his second act. Elara stood, her movements slow and deliberate, as if measuring the space around them with meticulous care. The Stonekeepers weren't simply guardians of this place. They understood the whispers of the stone, the echoes of power that flowed through it. It seems the Gatekeeper's severance unlocked a level of understanding, but it also granted the Weaver a new instrument, the very stone itself. She turned towards a particularly large, moss-covered slab, its surface riddled with the same complex runes. I believe we need to analyze these, to discern the patterns, the logic of this transformation. It's not a matter of simply extinguishing the Weaver's influence, it's a matter of directing it, of shaping it. Kaito approached, winter's breath feeling heavier in his hands. He reached out, his fingers tracing the cool, damp surface of the stone. The air around him shimmered, and he felt a flicker of the Weaver's residual energy, not as a hostile force, but as a submerged current, pulling at the edges of his awareness. He closed his eyes, focusing his mind, attempting to perceive the flow of energy within the stone, not as a weapon, but as a language. The severance didn't destroy the Weaver, he murmured, the words tasting of ash and something ancient, something profoundly sad. It fragmented him, scattered him across this valley, seeding the stone with his essence. It wasn't an ending, Elara. It was a beginning, a horrifying, unpredictable beginning. He sensed, with a chilling clarity, that the Weaver wasn't gone, merely dormant, waiting to be awakened, to reshape the valley, to perhaps one day reshape the world. The anticipation in the silence wasn't simply potential, it was a hunger. We can't simply contain it, he said, his voice grim. We need to understand its motives. Why did he choose to embed himself within this stone? What is he to create? Elara nodded, her eyes fixed on the altar. The runes are speaking to us, Kaito, but they're not telling us a story. They're offering a puzzle. And I suspect, with a terrible certainty, that the solution is far more dangerous than we could ever have imagined.